research partnership on small-scale fisheries in the context of this exciting Small is Bountiful webinar series that started all last week. And of course, also happy World Oceans Day to all of you. I would like to first of all acknowledge and thank the partners involved in the organization of this particular panel. In particular, the International Collective in Support of Fish Workers, that is ICSF, but also the Danish Institute for Human Rights, World Fish, Too Big to Ignore, and the IPC Fisheries Working Group. All of these were also our partners on a related webinar that took place on the 4th of June. And I would also, of course, thank all our panelists that are joining us for this session here today. I'm going to briefly introduce you to all of them. Let me start first with Eddie Allison. Many of you may know him already. Eddie's work spans research, policy, and practice in both fisheries science and international development. And he has worked on the coast and inland waters of sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Oceania, Latin America, North America, and Europe, principally on the contribution of fisheries and aquaculture to food and nutrition security and to coastal livelihoods, the governance of small-scale fisheries and aquaculture production, human rights issues in coastal communities, and people's vulnerability and adaptation to climate change. Since working in Malawi for the UK Department of International Development in the early 1990s, he has held faculty appointments in the School of International Development at the University of East Anglia, Norwich, UK, and the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs at the University of Washington in Seattle in the USA. He was also Director of Policy, Economics and Social Science at World Fish in Malaysia from 2007 to 2010 and has recently returned to World Fish to head a joint program on equity and justice in the blue economy with the Nippon Foundation. He has contributed to many policy processes, including also the early stages of what then became the Small-Scale Fisheries Guidelines that we're going to talk about more today. So welcome, Eddie, to this panel.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and it's fantastic to see the evolution and implementation of these guidelines. And do you want me to start, Nicole, with?
I'm just going to first do a brief introduction to all the speakers, and then we're going to start. Yeah. So our next speaker is Victor. Victor Fernandez Rojas. He has a degree in international relations with emphasis on international cooperation. He was a manager of the Office of International Affairs of the Costa Rican Institute of Fisheries and Aquaculture, or INCOPESCA, and also parliamentary advisor to the Legislative Assembly and the National Service of Animal Health. Victor now works as advisor for the executive presidency of INCOPESCA, and his tasks include supporting the implementation of the Small-Scale Fisheries Guidelines and the evaluation of the Costa Rican fisheries and aquaculture sector as part of the accession process to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, in Paris. Welcome to our panel, Victor.
Gracias, Nicole. Thank you so much. Thank you for TBTI and FAO to inviting us to share information about the process in Costa Rica. Thank you. Happy World Ocean Day.
Thank you. Our next panelist that I want to briefly introduce is Paul Onyango. Paul is a fisheries social scientist with over 20 years of research experience, primarily in East Africa. He lectures at the Department of Aquatic Sciences and Fisheries at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And Paul's research focuses on institutional aspects of fisheries management, governance challenges of poverty alleviation among small-scale fishers, and socioeconomic aspects of aquaculture. He has investigated the dilemmas authorities face in confronting poverty and managing small-scale fisheries. Welcome to this panel, also to you, Paul. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Nicole, and thanks everyone for joining this interesting panel, and I hope that we shall have an interesting interaction.
Thank you, Paul. Also on our panel, we have Megan Bailey. Megan is Associate Professor in Social Science and Humanities Council Research Chair with the Marine Affairs Program at Dalhousie University in Canada. Megan's research is motivated by notions of equity and fairness and a belief that the way humans use the ocean and the resources within should be governed in ways that ensure ecological resilience and social well-being. She has a background in fisheries economics and in marine governance. Welcome today, Megan, also to you.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to be here.
And last but not least, we have on our panel Mitchell Lay from Antigua and Barbuda. He's been fishing for over 30 years, and he's involved in fisherfolk organizations in Antigua and Barbuda, and is currently also involved in regional fisheries initiatives, including the Caribbean Network of Fisherfolk Organizations, or CNFO, and the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute. Mitch is a coordinator of the CNFO since 2007 and participates in fisheries-related meetings and workshops throughout the Caribbean region, and I would add also beyond, advocating for the responsible utilization of marine resources. So I will give you a very brief introduction to this panel, a little bit of a setting the scene before handing over to our panelists today. So thanks to all of you listening in, tuning in here, and thanks for your interest in our panel. The title of our panel is From Words to Action, Using the Small-Scale Fisheries Guidelines and Human Rights for Sustainable Small-Scale Fisheries. This panel today complements a webinar on the same theme that was held earlier this week on the 4th of June. And I invite you to listen to the video of that webinar in case you didn't have a chance to attend it directly. It is available on the TBTI YouTube channel on the Smallest Bountiful series. So please go and listen to that very, very interesting session from last week. So while I was preparing for the seminar here today, I noted lots of people entering the church, which is just in front of the house where I live here in Rome, in Italy. And I tried to find out what was happening, and it turned out that there was a memorial for George Floyd, the Afro-American citizen that was killed by a police officer in the US on 25th of May. And you are probably all aware of the huge protests that this death has triggered in the US, but also in other countries. Here in Rome, there was a big event on this just yesterday. So you may wonder why I'm talking about this in a panel on small-scale fisheries. Well, because this particular panel is about using the small-scale fisheries guidelines and human rights for sustainable small-scale fisheries, and about how we can go from words to action. And what just happened in the US recently is really an enormously important reminder for all of us of the fundamental importance to know, respect, fulfill, and protect human rights, be it in cities or in remote coastal areas where small-scale fisheries are important. And for small-scale fisheries, we are really in a privileged position because we do have an internationally agreed normative instrument that is specifically grounded in human rights. Many of you may know this instrument. These are the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries in the context of food security and poverty eradication, or in brief, the small-scale fisheries guidelines. What makes these small-scale fisheries guidelines stand out is that they really go beyond fisheries. They also look at really highlighting the rights of fishers and fish workers. So they're really about the people, not just about the fish. And the small-scale fisheries guidelines are aimed at all actors striving to secure sustainable small-scale fisheries, to end hunger and poverty, and strengthen human rights. They're a tool to guide policy dialogue, policy processes, and actions at all levels, from local communities to global fora. And my colleague Lena, who is helping with the chat box here, will share a link with more information to these small-scale fisheries guidelines in case you're not familiar with them yet. And this information is available on our website in English, in French, in Spanish, in Arabic, in Chinese, and in Russian. So these small-scale fisheries guidelines were endorsed by the FAO Committee on Fisheries in 2014, and they were developed through a participatory process. And this participatory process involved both right holders and duty bearers. So let me explain that a little bit more in case you haven't been in the webinar last week, where there was also a bit explained by our partners. Small-scale fishers and fish workers participated actively through the organizations in the development of the small-scale fisheries guidelines. And according to the human rights-based approach, small-scale fishers, fish workers, their organizations, and the communities they are part of are right holders. So they need to know their rights and be able to claim them. For instance, they should be able to participate in decision-making processes in a non-discriminatory and transparent manner. They also need to be aware of ways to claim their rights to food, or to the right to an adequate standard of living, or to decent working conditions, among others. The realization of these rights is important to ensure that small-scale fishers and fish workers use natural resources sustainably and can lead decent lives based on small-scale fisheries. All of these human rights are enshrined in a number of core international human instruments, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Now, in addition to the right holders, the development process of the SSF guidelines also involves states, intergovernmental organizations, and other actors, which are duty bearers, according to the human rights-based approach. Duty bearers have the duty to respect, to fulfill, and protect the human rights of the right holders. So the participatory process for the development of the small-scale fisheries guidelines, which involved both, on one hand, the right holders, and on the other hand, the duty bearers, as well as a breadth of issues that are addressed in the small-scale fisheries guidelines that include tenure and fisheries management, social development, employment and decent work, value chains, post-harvest and trade, gender equity, disaster risk and climate change. And also the fact that this internationally agreed instrument is grounded in a human rights-based approach really provides these small-scale fisheries guidelines with a level of legitimacy and moral imperative that transcends their voluntary nature. And today, more than ever, we need to use this powerful instrument and work together on its inclusion, in particular also in national regulatory frameworks, to really provide the enabling environment for action for small-scale fisheries. So just briefly, if you come back to the case of George Floyd as an example how to turn words into action. In the US, the state of Minnesota has now filed a human rights investigation against the Minneapolis police in a follow-up to what happened. And this investigation will provide the basis for identifying and addressing fundamental human rights flaws in that regard. So this is an example of how a human rights mechanism can be applied to use human rights to trigger action. It is therefore really important also for small-scale fisheries to understand human rights, what they mean, how they apply, how they can be realized. And this requires that those working in small-scale fisheries or in support of small-scale fisheries know the rights and the related mechanisms to realize those rights. It is also equally important that human rights defenders and mechanisms better understand small-scale fisheries so that they can take action in support of sustainable small-scale fisheries. So as explained in the webinar that took place last week on 4th of June, we need to look for partnerships also beyond fisheries with those human rights institutions. So what are we going to do today? With our panelists, we want to continue developing our common understanding of how the principles of the small-scale fisheries guidelines can be applied in practice and help empower rights holders and hold duty bearers accountable in order to achieve sustainable small-scale fisheries. Before we listen to experiences with implementing specific thematic areas of the small-scale fisheries guidelines, I would like to first invite our first panelist, Eddie Allison, to share some more thoughts on how human rights and the small-scale fisheries guidelines are linked. Eddie, can I hand this over to you, please? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicole, for a really clear explanation. I can hear an echo at the moment. Is that going to go? Yes. Okay.
You need to mute us. Yes.
Yep. And also for bringing the relevance of human rights approaches right up to date to what's going on here. Here I'm sitting in the US and now. The origins of how did human rights and the management of fisheries come together in one instrument? When we first began talking about that, there was a bit of skepticism. And if you look back, there is a logic, the convergence of several things at a particular time that led, first of all, to actions that had been taking place in small-scale fisheries, in international organizations, in research, that weren't very coordinated. So actually the first step was to turn these actions into words, to develop the basis for this kind of thinking and instrument. And then the challenge, of course, over the last decade has been to turn those words back into tangible actions. So the spirit behind the guidelines, what sort of brought these quite disparate worlds of human rights and social development together with the issue of fisheries management was, there are 5 strands, I think, that I can identify. I think the first one was that there was a growing integration of the need to, or a growing sense that you needed to understand social issues in small-scale fisheries. A lot of fisheries science had concentrated on looking at the relationship between the environment, fish, and fishing activities, and wasn't really looking at what was happening in fisher folks' lives, in their places of work, and the places that they lived. And so, as a focus turned on trying to bring fisheries management more into the world of kind of social and economic development, then people began to pay more attention to these other aspects of people's lives, and particularly to conditions of poverty that were observed experienced in many fishing communities around the world. And the expansion of the idea of poverty beyond looking at just income and assets and towards things like vulnerability and social and political exclusion, marginalization. I think that was an important part of saying, hey, actually, these are some of the issues that need to be addressed alongside, thinking about sustainable fisheries management if you're going to have sustainable, thriving communities. And at the same time, that opened up the fact that different people within communities were vulnerable to different extents. So gender analysis and looking at differences between people's experiences depending on their ethnicity, their social class, their economic status, whether they were old or young, men, women. And so a much more social approach to fisheries was a key part. Second one was there was a history in small-scale fisheries, particularly in some countries like India, of grassroots community development, the cooperative movements. And the International Collective in Support of Fish Workers, John Kurian and Sebastian Matthew and Chandrika Sharma came from that world and brought that experience to the international organizations and donor agencies and governments who were attempting to manage fisheries. And that really brought that perspective from fisher folks' voices and also their aspirations to work collectively. Collaboration with fisheries social scientists also began to happen. You got this rise of scholar activists, people who were both interested in and working towards the welfare of fishing communities, but were also studying those communities in a scholarly way. Before, there was a bit of a division between those kinds of people, and you now find more people who are sort of hybrid scholar activists, and that's kind of become more acceptable in academic institutions. You also had political campaigns, I think, in other sectors that began to use human rights approaches. I think the most notable one was the campaign to end blood diamonds. So that took a very explicit human rights approach and really moved us beyond the idea of, that you could opt into something like fair trade. So if you can have fair trade as a voluntary thing, you can presumably, it's also okay to have unfair trade, which of course it isn't. And the human rights turn and the emphasis on violations in certain value chains, I think, legitimized the turn towards human rights to look at fish value chains. And the fifth sort of major strand, I think, that behind the spirit of the guidelines was the adoption of a human rights perspective in international development. Human rights law, of course, had been there since 1948, the first declarations, and has been added to piecemeal and elaborated since then. But it hadn't really been applied to development, which was more about the transfer of funds and from wealthier governments to poorer governments, and was framed as assistance or charity, and something that you gave out of benevolence, not something that that you were duty bound to assist people, and that governments and donors and others were instead that people had a right to a decent life, and if actions of states and others undermined people's ability to have a decent work and access to a livelihood and access to water and food, then that was a human rights violation, not just an opt-in, opt-out charitable option. And bringing those strands together, plus the strongest thing that bound those together was the activism of fisherfolk and fisherfolk's organizations themselves, who were really leading the protests against some of the inactions and hostile actions of governments and transnational corporations and other powerful actors, the inadvertent or misguided policies of donor agencies and international organizations as well. They were complaining and doing so on the basis of human rights. So it really was a case of bringing these strands of thinking together and getting them into the FAO committee process and putting the arguments that if you wanted to sustain small-scale fisheries, it would probably be most effective if you took a human rights approach. And I think small-scale fisher organizations got behind that and seized the opportunity and really pushed it forward through the process that Nicole described above. So for me, that's the roots of the guidelines. Linkages between grassroots social activism, anchored in some scholarly analysis of what was going on, building on social development, grassroots social development, and a broad systemic perspective on the complexities of fishing lives as well as the actual fishing process. And the spirit of recognizing that you can't really separate small-scale fishing as an activity from the rest of what's going on in coastal zones and in people's lives more generally. Thanks very much.
Sorry, I'm muted. Thank you very much, Eddie, for reminding us of the importance of the history behind it and how many things were coming together in that particular moment in time, and that enabled also the acceptance or the elevation of the human rights-based approach into fisheries. So thank you very much for sharing that, because we can say that you have certainly been one of the drivers also behind that, also within the FAO processes to get us to where we are today. So thank you very much. The next panelist will now give us a little bit more of an example of what is happening at country level. And we will have a contribution from Victor, who will give us some more specific experience about what it means to implement the Chapter 5 of the guidelines that deals with responsible governance of tenure and sustainable resource management. So Victor is going to tell us a bit about what the key aspects of secure tenure for small-scale fisheries mean and how the human rights apply in this context. So Victor, please tell us about some examples from Costa Rica, also on legislating for and implementing the small-scale fisheries guidelines and human rights. The floor is yours.
Gracias, Nicole. Buenos días. Good morning from Costa Rica. Thank you for inviting us to share about our work in the implementation process of the small-scale fishery guidelines on this World Ocean Day. Let me say a little message in Spanish for those who accompany us in this side of the world. Feliz Día del Océano. Muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos en ese día tan importante y desde Costa Rica pues compartir el mensaje acerca del proceso de implementación de directrices de pesca en pequeña escala. In the first instance, I would like to respond to Nicole's query about the key aspects of secure tenure for SSF and how the human rights apply in this context. As Nicole states, according to the human rights-based approach, the small-scale fishers, their organizations, and the communities they are part of are right holders. So they need to know the rights and they should be able to participate in decision-making in a non-discriminatory and transparent manner. In this order, the intergovernmental organizations like fisheries authorities and others are the reviewers. So, like we have, like fisheries authorities, we have the duty to respect, fulfill, protect the human rights. And here, the key are the participatory process in decision making, where all the stakeholder interest in the resource management have to be included in the processes. Finally, the human rights-based approach is a must for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries. Any project or any program supporting the small-scale fisheries needs to promote and protect the human rights. Having said that, I can't omit to mention that based on the guidance, the government of Costa Rica has taken important steps to establish a legal framework. Since 2015 or 2015, with FAO support, civil society organizations like Cope Solidar and the network of the marine area of responsible fishing, the guidelines were established by executive decree. The decree provides that the government of Costa Rica is officially in charge of the informing of the guidelines and use the competent public authorities and institutions to include this in their respective operating plans to allocate the necessary financial resources to carry out such actions. From 2015 to date, several actions have been taken in communities with the purpose of promoting and disseminating the guidelines, developing model cases according to thematic lines, supporting the regional agenda of implementation within the framework of the Central American Organization of the Fisheries and Aquaculture Sector, PESCA, developing a draft law for the small-scale fisheries sector. Based on this, we have been working to strengthen the implementation process, following up specific cases in the context of the marine areas of responsible fishing. That is like a command management model that is being scaled up across the country. It's important to note that the model ensures integration of effort towards sustainable small-scale fishery. It also helps small-scale fishing communities to maintain their cultural identity, way of life. Recently, with FAO support and fishermen from the Caribbean of the country, last December, a new marine area of responsible fishing was created, where the fishery management was fishery management plan was based on the ecosystem approach to fisheries and the guidance too. For the next 2 years, in the same context, from Incopesca with the fisheries organization support, we work to review and reform two fisheries management plans in other areas to improve them according to the ecosystem approach of fisheries and the guidelines. In addition, create 2 new marine co-management areas in line with the spirit of the guidelines. I cannot fail to mention that Incopesca has engaged with small-scale fishers as well as academia, NGOs, legislators to review the draft law on small-scale fisheries that is currently on the Costa Rican Parliament for approval, including other stakeholders in the process. About the tenure for the next 2 years from Incopesca with FAO support and the Mesa Nacional Indígena, that is the indigenous national network, will work to ensure the access to the resources based in the customary rights to aquatic resources of indigenous people in Costa Rica, specifically in the Caribbean and the Pacific coast. For the indigenous territory on the Pacific, we'll be doing a participatory process to build a fishery management plan that's including the indigenous cosmovision, securing the access to the marine resources that uses for different activities like craft and religious belief. In the Costa Rican Caribbean, there is an indigenous territory called Kekoldi. With the support from the Mesa Nacional Indígena and the FAO, we will work a process to do a governance model, including continental fishers, indigenous from these zones, government agencies, and other stakeholders to promote and secure the access to the resources. Finally, from Incopesca, in these processes, we agree that the small-scale fishing communities can play an important role in managing, restoring, conserving, and protecting aquatic resources and ecosystems. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you very much, Victor, for giving us a bit of insight about what is happening at the country level. If there's the political will to in a way move from having a voluntary instrument to exploring how it can be integrated actually into the regulatory framework at the national, and also to work in particular with this participatory approach. So really ensuring that there is a space of consultation from the beginning with small-scale fishers, but also looking at the different groups within small-scale fishers, in particular the attention given to indigenous peoples. There's also a lot of work focusing on gender happening in Costa Rica. So I think this is really good to have Costa Rica as a champion to go into this process and take on the challenge of exploring how this rather complex instrument can actually be applied. So thank you very much for sharing this with us, Victor. Thank you.
Gracias, Nicole.
So our next speaker is Paul Onyango from Tanzania. So Paul will speak a little bit more to Chapter 6 and Chapter 8 of the Small-Scale Fisheries Guidelines. Chapter 6 of the guidelines deals with social development, employment, and decent work. And Chapter 8 focuses specifically on gender equity. It's the first time that a fisheries instrument actually has a dedicated chapter on the issue of gender. So that in itself is an achievement of the guidelines. And Paul will share some experience in how it can look if we try to implement it, if we try to move from words to action, from the paper to making things happen on the ground. Paul, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you also for inviting me to give a perspective on on Chapter 6 and Chapter 8 of the SSF Guidelines. Now, when Nicole was making an introductory remark, she mentioned that SSF goes beyond the fish. And this is the focus on Chapter 6 and Chapter 8. And I would give you some information with regards to how this has been reflected in Tanzania, but also draw some lessons from other African countries. And what we see within the context of the SSF is that small-scale fisheries continues to be recognized by governments. And that recognition, in a number of cases, we have state governments establishing responsible ministries specific for small-scale fisheries. We can have fisheries both, in the marine and in the inland, but now we've had also fisheries, industrial fisheries. But we see now that there is a more focus on the small-scale fisheries. For example, in South Africa, there is a small-scale fisheries policy that has come out. In a number of countries, we also have these fully fledged ministries that have been formed. In Tanzania, again, out of this ministry, the ministry authorities have set up a national task force to coordinate SSF issues, especially in the implementation of the SSF guidelines. And this is a crucial point in that the government recognizes the role that SSF is playing within the lives, not only the fisheries, but within the lives of the small-scale fishers. And we also see this in terms of government seeking opinions from the small-scale fishers whenever there is a change in regulation or review in regulation or policies. The government actually goes out to small-scale fishers so as to get their opinion and have a say. The small-scale fishers have a say in the revised or in the review process that goes on. The second aspect that we see with regards to social development and employment is that SSF is viewed or perceived and seen as safeguarding well-being. And in this case, within the SSF communities, there is a care system that has been implemented. The SSF themselves have a care system in which they take care of themselves whenever somebody has got a problem, whenever somebody has got a ceremony. We see a care system, people taking care of others within that system. Even the fishers themselves, they give out fish to their fellow fishermen when they go fishing, and when the other fellow fishermen did not go fishing, believing that next time they can go fishing and the other one is not going, then we'll also get fish from them. We also see within this safeguarding of well-being that within the SSF communities, we are coming up with education programs, building schools. The small-scale fishers are themselves organizing themselves, building schools to support education from within their communities. And this has been actually made possible by the fact that the governments, several governments have primarily declared a universal primary education that is fully paid by the government. Now, what they need to do is to partner with the government in order to put up structures through which their kids can actually also get access to education. SSF has been a connecting mechanism for communities. And this we see very interestingly in access to information, which is extended to fishing communities. Today, for instance, we have mobile networks into the remotest parts of the country where the small-scale fishers are located. They are connected, they are networks. We see roads and schools that I've mentioned. And this is indeed a very encouraging activity and encouraging thing that communities are getting connected. The other thing is that we have inclusiveness through promotion that connect community. We see a number of vulnerable groups, the women, the youth, coming up, and they are made part and parcel of these communities that are connected to each other. The last point that I want to make is with regards to small-scale fisheries enhancing affordable and quality lifestyle. And within the Tanzanian context, through the national task force that the ministry formed, We have the entity has mobilized women, and women have formed a national association through which they are championing, voicing their needs, voicing their issues, and giving out their opinions. And this is a very strong indication of how the government continually and continuously support the small-scale fisheries. The government has also decided to form a gender desk at the ministry level, to cater for gender issues within the sector. Then we also have consultations for legal review, as I mentioned earlier on. Lastly is the issue of encouraging community participation in fisheries management. And we see this in a number of fisheries across Africa. Start from Mozambique, you mentioned, come up Malawi, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, all these places you move up. We see small-scale fisher communities are included as part of the decision-making process through their organizations. In some places, they call them the beach management units, for instance, in Tanzania. So we see, in a nutshell, what we're talking about here, is that there is the aspect of human rights being seen beyond just looking at the fish, but looking also at the society, at the small-scale fishers communities, and trying to give them the opportunity, trying to give them the making fisheries as somebody said earlier, that anyone would want to do what he likes according to his heart and according to his mind. This was a quote that I take from one of the small-scale fishers around Lake Victoria in Tanzania. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you very much for this contribution, Paul. So Tanzania is, in fact, another country that is taking a very active approach to implement the small-scale fisheries guidelines. As Paul was saying, there's this national task force, a task team, that is composed of representatives from the government, from the small-scale fisheries organizations, from academia. So that's really in the spirit of the guidelines themselves, to do the planning for the process from the beginning with representation from all of these different actors. And the commitment, again, from government is very important, but also at the same time, as you were saying, it's very important to have the organizations involved and to have them prepared to engage in the processes. So we are very happy to see this establishment of this women's organization at the national level, to see how women can participate much more actively in policy making, but also in other decision-making processes that affect their livelihoods, but also in terms of just improving their own standing in the value chain. And that is actually what we're going to talk about now with our next speaker. So thank you, Paul. I'm gonna call on our next speaker, which is Megan Bailey. So Megan is in fact going to speak a little bit more about what else is happening in small-scale fisheries. We heard a lot now about the enabling regulatory framework. We heard about involvement in co-management or in decision-making processes. We haven't spoken so much yet about the other important part, the value chain. What is happening in terms of trade? And the question that we have put to Megan is how human rights can be applied and respected when upgrading value chains, for example, in relation to standards and certification, and how related practices have evolved, and what collaborations by different stakeholders are needed in this context to ensure transparent and sustainable value chains. Megan, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much, and thanks again for the invitation. It's been really nice seeing the comments from everyone around the world. So it's wonderful. Keep the comments coming and any questions. I think much of the research on value chain interventions, be they certifications, fisheries improvement projects, traceability, a lot of that research has been pretty critical, where these interventions are kind of deemed as falling short of their intended outcomes. And I think most of the projects have aspirational goals about the many benefits that should accrue to fish harvesters and local traders and processors, but that implementation in ways that respects, protects, and fulfills human rights has been difficult. But there are lots of really wonderful stories as well. And I'm going to try to touch on both of those. So kind of why have we gotten it wrong and where are we getting it right? And for me, I think in taking a human rights-based approach to value chains, post-harvest, and trade, getting it right means redressing discriminatory practices and unjust distributions of power that have impeded development progress in a sector where power almost always lies downstream with buyers and retailers. And often those buyers and retailers are in export markets. These powerful actors engage through the value chain with other actors like NGOs, academia, and funders to upgrade and differentiate the chain. I'm going to walk through a hypothetical example just to indicate where some of the fundamentals of a human rights-based approach may get left behind. I'm going to take the Marine Stewardship Council certification as an example, but this isn't exclusive to MSC. I think some of the things I'm going to bring up apply to other certifications and other value chain interventions as well. So MSC and most other certifications are supposed to be voluntary. So these are understood as supplementary avenues a group of producers can choose to take to differentiate themselves. And it involves assessment against two standards. So one is the fisheries standard about kind of fishing practices on the water. And the other is a chain of custody standard. And so that includes local traders and processors, anyone who kind of touches the product. What I've observed is that in many cases, fish harvesters and local traders have no idea that they've entered into an assessment and that they'll be subjected to audits from a market-based conceptualization of sustainability that's been developed totally outside of their own context. And I think it's really important to say that this is as true for lobster fish harvesters in Nova Scotia as it is for tuna harvesters in Ambon, Indonesia. So in both of these cases, many fish harvesters are entered into these voluntary programs, but more or less without their consent. And for me, these kinds of approaches don't support Article 7.1, so participation in decision-making. I think it's important to say, like, certifications, they have a role and there can be benefits and positives associated with that. But certainly that participatory process has not really been seen in some of the kind of big certifications to date. If we contrast that with something like Abelobi, so a data-driven platform, which is really based on relationships connecting fish harvesters and chefs and consumers in South Africa. So as I understand Abelobi, fish harvesters truly opt in to this, and in doing so, they have access to data that can help them be part of a decision-making process. It also gives them an income identity, so a way to prove that they have an income, and that allows them to more fruitfully take part in public life. I'm going to move just away from Marine Stewardship Council certification to Fair Trade USA certification. So they developed a capture fisheries standard, I think in 2013. This standard more closely aligns with the FAO guidelines for small-scale fisheries compared to an ecological standard like the MSC. We did a benchmarking analysis that looked at those two standards and benchmarked them against the small-scale fisheries guidelines. In the fair trade model, fish harvesters have to be represented by a fishing association, and the collective of those are represented by a fair trade committee. The fair trade committee maintains transparency records of the fishery and the fair trade premiums that are received, and makes decisions about how those premiums should be used, how those funds should be spent. And so that kind of process, I think, is the spirit and intent of 7.4. So recognizing support and development for associations. But there are still ethical considerations about who gets to join in these programs, right? So as an NGO, if you show up to a community and you kind of go to one community and not another, or one fish harvester's house and not, her or his neighbor, you're inviting some people into the program, and then the benefits of that program aren't necessarily distributed with fairness in mind, which seems to be intended under 7.8. I want to turn to Nunavut, which is an Inuit territory in northern Canada, just to give an example of the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board, which is a tripartite government management board. In their allocation policy for commercial fisheries, they specifically have something in there about benefits to community. So in being granted allocation to the fishery, you get more allocation if you can demonstrate that by fishing, you're providing benefits to the communities. And communities have to, write support letters to indicate that they've received those benefits. And there's some transparency around that. This is in line with Inuit values and Inuit knowledge called Inuit Kaimayatu Changit. And that's actually written into the allocation policy for commercial fishing. And that's a pretty neat example. Much of the value chain work that I'm aware of really links with global markets and is highly driven by global buyers. But it's really clear in the guidelines that local markets need to be taken into account. And particularly the role of informal markets, the role of women, that these are very important to the seafood sector around the world. There are many gaps about these informal roles in markets. I think the role of the FAO and their work in the Hidden Harvest projects is really commendable, and more needs to be done to understand the whole value chain, informal and formal. And in accordance with 7.2 and 7.7, I want to touch briefly on another Inuit area in Canada called Nunatsiavut, and the case of Arctic char and the Torngat Fish Producers Co-op. So in Nunatsiavut in Northern Labrador, the co-op is an Inuit-owned cooperative, and it has access to the only Arctic char fishery. Char is a lucrative species. It's farmed and sold for high prices in upscale North American restaurants. But the co-op has purposefully avoided conversations around exporting char, certifying char. And mostly that's because the entire catch is sold within the Inuit territory of Nunatsiavut. And it's available in community freezers throughout the region. And those community freezers feed elders, people who can no longer fish. And so char is really important for food security. I think a similar probably argument can be made for decisions the government of the Maldives. So Poland line skipjack, a huge export-driven market for that, a lot of sustainability, kind of branding around that, and yet Maldivians eat kind of, I think, 8 times the average fish consumption per capita. So the government and the value chains obviously have had, made some kind of decision that enough tuna has to remain in the Maldives to feed Maldivians, while still kind of getting access to foreign currency through a huge export market. So there are lots of examples. And I think some of these examples I've provided, we can see that there are many different types of parties taking responsibility. So I have on the slide here just listed a few of the ones I mentioned today and a couple others I didn't have time to mention. But we saw tech providers, standard settings, tripartite government management bodies, cooperatives that are all taking responsibility to promote a human rights-based approach through value chain kinds of activities. So I think I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Megan, for sharing a lot of concrete examples, also of the collaboration and the role of NGOs in looking at different ways to value small-scale fisheries products, in particular those that are more connected to global markets, but in some cases like Abalobi, it's also servicing very much the domestic markets, local markets. So there are alternative models, and there are results that we are seeing that show how a more participatory process, a better distribution of benefits along the value chain can function as an alternative model to those, say, certification schemes that are maybe out there that have been designed for different types of fisheries, but that there are tools that can be used to really elevate the profile and the visibility of small-scale fisheries also in terms of value chains. Thank you very much, Megan, for this. I'm now going to call on our last speaker. Again, last but not least, we have our colleague Mitch from the Caribbean. Mitch is going to look a little bit more at Chapter 9 of the Small-Scale Fisheries Guidelines, and talk to us a little bit about what particular human rights issues do disasters and climate change imply for small-scale fisheries, and how a human rights-based approach can be applied in the context of disaster risks. Mitch, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Nicole, and greetings to everyone that have joined us today. So as Nicole indicated, I want to touch a little bit on some of the issues that are posed by climate change and disaster situations. So first, climate change and disaster situations bring to us, generally speaking, a change in the pattern of life. It disrupts the fabric of life for fishing communities particularly, which are fairly vulnerable to these, being on the coast and directly impacted by both climate change and disasters. So in impacting the fabric of life, they affect human dignity. And that's the first major point I want to make. They affect human dignity. For those of us who are affected, we must change. We no longer have the same type of access to decent work. We no longer have the same type of access to security. For these situations usually bring about a dislocation of communities and individuals. And freedom of movement, things like those are directly impacted, yes? As well as the issue of social security, provision of safe food and water, safe drinking water, the issue of access to health and education. All these are directly impacted when we look at disasters and climate change risk. But I also want to make a point that the impacts are differential based on gender. So women are impacted differently to men, and this is something that we need to take into consideration as we look at the impacts from both climate change and disaster situations. So how can we use a human rights-based approach to address these? So the first issue is to be clearly aware of what the human rights provisions are. So we understand that we need to have, access to health, to education facilities. We need to have access to food and of course, safe drinking water. And also we need to have continued access to livelihood opportunities, decent work and employment. So if we are to really address the issues in small-scale fishing communities, my view is that one of the first movement that needs to happen is that we engage the communities pre-disaster situations, and we engage them in institutionalized and legitimate mechanisms. So not ad hoc, but we have mechanisms in place so that when situations like these occur, and climate change is a continuing occurrence, we have engagement so that impacts are felt and the needs to address the issues are recognized, and collectively we put together plans to do those things. So I want to maybe make an example of what is happening now in terms of COVID-19 and how I would recommend we look at these. So during this particular pandemic, we have clear issues in the fishing communities. We have issues relating to access, both access to health and social services, but also access to the inputs that fishers need to continue their livelihood activities. We also have restrictions in terms of the ability to actually work, but quite significantly, we have issues in terms of access to markets. So COVID-19 has presented significant challenges as well in terms of small-scale fisheries communities. And by note, we would mention that it has been studied that women are impacted more significantly in the small-scale fisheries than men, and mainly because they work in the post-harvest sector primarily, and therefore the marketing issue is a critical issue. So how do we properly address these in terms of a human rights-based approach? As I mentioned earlier, if we have institutionalized mechanisms that can actually deal with the issues of mitigation and also response, then we would have at least some engagement where the fishing communities are involved in the process of mitigation methods such as building resilience, etc. And also they are involved in the response. So this is extremely important. So I give an example of Hurricane Irma in Barbuda in 2017, and also Dominica in Hurricane Maria. The government's response did not properly address the small-scale fisheries sector. And I say this in the context of the small-scale fisheries sector being able to respond rapidly if it has the right type of support and the right type of mechanisms in place. Even though it's impacted most, it has the ability to respond quite quickly to disasters and climate change scenarios, and to continue making useful contribution to society in terms of food security, livelihoods, etc. So if we have that mechanism that is institutionalized, that deals with the issue of participation, we can address both the issues of mitigation and the issues of response. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very important contribution from a region that is certainly experienced in terms of impacts of disaster risk and climate change. As you were just mentioning, the last 2 hurricanes, and I guess also now the situation with COVID is having an impact in your communities. So thank you very much for sharing those thoughts and the need to institutionalize these partnerships. I think this is something that is coming through from all panelists, that there seems to be an acknowledgement of the principle of participation. So it's about making sure that this really is, as it is already happening in many places, it is becoming more and more institutionalized, so that any decision making and any process that directly impacts the lives of small-scale fishers and their communities has that enabling mechanism for participation. So it's good to see that there are some examples of that already existing, but I think that there remains much more to do in that regard. So I'm now going to bring all the panelists back. We have the chat box. I'm inviting everybody who's listening into the session to submit any questions. I know that there has been one question that came in that I would like the panel to address from our friend Sergio Matos from Brazil. Some of you may know him. So Sergio is asking if having the small-scale fisheries guidelines and the SDGs as strong instruments, how to develop capacity building based on trust, ethics, and moral values that allow to support most isolated fishing communities. So is there anybody who would like to reply to Sergio on this one?
Maybe I can try. Am I being heard?
Go ahead, Paul. Yes.
Yes. Just to share my ideas on this is that I think there is need to trust is the fact that those who are either the target or those who are the subjects.
You're breaking up a bit, Paul.
What is going on? Oh, then that could be my.
Yeah, I'm afraid we're losing the connection here to Paul. So while Paul is hopefully reconnecting, does anybody else want to have the floor to share some thoughts on how capacity building based on trust can happen?
Yes, Nicole, perhaps I can lend my voice. Yes. I think one of the critical issues is to appreciate the communities as they are and how they operate. So when there's that appreciation of community, then we can assess where the community's capacities lie. For sometimes we think that there's low capacity because we don't understand that the capacity may lie in a different type of direction, but just needs to be harnessed to actually apply to this particular situation of guidelines and SDGs. But one of the key issues is, I think, that in addition to that assessment, we need to bring an appreciation of what the instruments are, what they bring to the table, and how they directly relate to the livelihoods of these small communities. And I think that is critically important, to bring that awareness and that appreciation. So thank you.
Thanks for sharing the view from your perspective from the regional organization, also for small scale fishers. I think assessing the situation is quite important. No, how currently the small scale fisheries guidelines principles are already applied or not in a country, and there are a few tools that are already available that have been developed and tested by USAID, for example. FAO, we're working on some tools, so that's an important first step to understand the situation and address shortcomings, probably. Anybody else would like to have a comment? I see Megan, your hand is up.
Sorry, hi, thanks. Yeah, just kind of building on that, this idea of asset mapping, I think is really important. And I think there's often this kind of homogeneity assumption around capacity. Well, this community doesn't have capacity. Well, in what way, in what forms of assets are they strong, or might they be lacking? And kind of tailored programs that really focus on that. Nicole, one of the things you mentioned at the beginning that I can't get out of my head, and even though I've read the two terms, duty bearers and rights holders, so many times, is this, I think the fundamental shift in thinking here of seeing the fish harvesting sector and fish harvesters as these rights holders, as opposed to, people that we need to control because their actions don't align with what we think we want for fishing sustainability. And I think in line with those thoughts, if we not picking and choosing certain communities, right, to be part of a program or to benefit, and saying everyone is a rights holder, every kind of fish harvester within the sector is a rights holder, and how do we work towards distributing benefits from a program, even in isolated areas and isolated communities. And even if it comes to some kinds of, asking funders to step up and say, okay, if you're going to fund this project here, you need to find money to also fund a community is more isolated, and bringing them into kind of some participatory model for that, because I do think there's this, kind of reinforcement of effort within communities that have been part of programs, and you put something else in, you put something else in, you put something else in, instead of trying to look at a funding model that would support programs across other communities that might be more isolated. So those are just a couple thoughts.
Thanks for this, Megan. There are some other questions coming in the chat box. Does somebody still want to react to this question of capacity development based on trust? Otherwise, maybe we look at some of the other questions. I have specific questions, I think, for Mitch and for Megan. I'm informed by Lena. Let me see. Okay, let me bring up one question that goes to Mitch again. This is from our colleague Manas from ICSF. He's asking whether there are any recent examples of more inclusive disaster risk management in the Caribbean, improved early warnings for fishers, or their participation in response, relief, and recovery. Are you aware of any of those, Mitch?
Okay, so I would say yes, and I'll give some examples. So in the Caribbean, we have a Caribbean Community Common Fisheries Policy, and recently we have elaborated 2 protocols to support the implementation of that policy. One of the protocol is the inclusion of the Small-Scale Fisheries Guidelines, and the other protocol is the inclusion of a disaster risk management sort of a protocol that looks at how we deal with disasters in the fisheries sector, particularly. And Caribbean fisherfolk have been involved to some degree in the elaboration of both protocols. Yes, so that's part of the risk management mix to deal with the planning process. In addition, we have, for instance, after some hurricanes, particularly Irma and Maria, Caribbean fisherfolk has been actively involved in doing the assessment and looking at how we actually move forward. So, for instance, in Barbuda, Antigua and Barbuda, the small island, we actually started to fish before anything else after Hurricane Irma. But we also had a prepared assessment and some recommendations on response. So that's inclusive. Now, when we say inclusive, we may mean, if we mean that it is specifically sanctioned by the governance structures, then that is a bigger question that I may not be able to address in sort of short space of time. But yes, inclusive in that we shared with the government and we collaborated with the government entities. So yes. In terms of improved early warning systems, so we have done quite a bit of work on that in the Caribbean region with some of our partners, Caribbean Network of Fisheries Organization, in collaboration with quite a few of our partners, including the FAO and the University of West Indies and several other partners as well. So we have at the moment, of course, there is the hurricane preparedness mix, which is not just specifically for fishers, but we have looked at how we get fishers aware of the different media that has the warning systems. But also very importantly, we look at the sargassum phenomenon, and there is an early warning system for sargassum influx, and they have an outlook currently for this period. So those are some of the types of initiatives in the region at the moment. I guess that answers your question, Manas.
Thanks, Mitch. I'm looking at the chat box where the questions are coming in. There were some questions looking, I think, at the value chain, at the markets. There was a question. Let me see. I think this will go more. Let me see, to Megan, but maybe it's something also that others can help with. Maybe Eddie or Victor also. Are there any examples you're aware of that have overcome this challenge? And this challenge being that supply chains are highly dependent on access to territories. So it's basically when there's an issue of logistics and connectivity, in particular for more remote communities, to actually benefit from like fair trade schemes or equal opportunities in terms of accessing markets. So are there any experiences that you know of where small-scale fisheries have been able to overcome these connectivity and logistics problems to benefit fairly from markets? Anyone would like to share thoughts on that? Maybe Victor, there was a case of this women's organization, a mollusk group. I don't know if there's something on how they got access to markets and there's something to share. Or otherwise, Megan, if you have thoughts.
Okay, I'm here. Megan, if you prefer, is your experience area?
Yeah, sorry, Nicole. I'll give a couple thoughts, but I really would love to hear from everyone else as well. When I first read that question, I was kind of thinking about access in a couple of different ways, and one being kind of physical access and logistical challenges, but then also kind of political and economic access as well, which is often very limited. So I'll touch on a couple of things. I know, one of the issues, particularly for export-driven trade, where a lot of the kind of the certifications play a role, is the post-harvest handling of seafood is really important, right? And so if you cannot get the fish kind of iced when it's caught and on ice for the entire time that it gets to a local trader, a local processing plant, et cetera, that's a real problem. So I've seen lots of kind of micro projects of motorcycle ice boxes, this kind of thing. I think it's difficult to scale those up. So it's fine if you're in a community where, a few tuna get landed on a given day and you can kind of put those loins in an ice box and put them on a motorcycle. One of the, I think, I'm going to try to make this a short answer, but I think this was from Natalie, so please send me an email if you want to chat more about this, is looking at the fair trade model, which often problematizes the role of middlemen and these local traders, right, as kind of taking too much value from the value chain. But, you know, in some of the areas that we've looked at, they really play a huge role in getting product to market for communities that are far away. And so I think a real nuanced understanding of that, of the role of local traders in providing, you know, if it's ice, if it's transport, if it's sometimes it's medical assistance, it's rice, it's school tuition, it's all kinds of community supports that are really important. And so again, just trying to make sure that when we say something is fair trade, I don't know. I mean, like, yeah, how do we ensure that we're kind of thinking ethically about every actor within that value chain and the role that they play in contributing to community benefits? And so I think the role of local traders can be maybe better understood and better utilized to help connect communities that are farther away. And I'll just touch on one other real quick example, which is in Nunatsiavut in northern Labrador, which I was speaking about. So the char fishery is really localized out of an area called Nain Bay. And that stock is, they're worried that that subpopulation is becoming overfished. But they know that when they take their skidoos out on the ice and they can get really far out of Nain Bay in the winter, they find a lot of char. And so there's a question of, in the summer, when the commercial fishery is open, you have only boat access and only a couple people have boats, right? So you can only catch so much char in this one small area in the summertime, but in the winter, they're saying there's tons of char out there, but there's no access to economic capital to have boats, basically, or to finance boats in that area. And so there's a thought that if they had access to boats, they could fish further out and catch way more char, but there hasn't been kind of a political willingness to think economically about how to promote capital and infrastructure and boats for that community. So that's kind of an example where it's not particularly happening well. But yeah, I'd really love to hear from others as well.
Thank you for taking this question, Megan. There is another question. Let me pull it out of the, so maybe in the meantime, just one thing to inform you, you may see we have lost one of our panelists, Paul, unfortunately. He has chatted and told us that he has connection issues, so unfortunately he will not be able to connect back, but we still have our other panelists. So I would like to hear a little bit more from Eddie on how the human rights-based approach is in a way then different from usual. And this can also be linked to a question that came in from our audience here on what the impacts brought up by the COVID-19 for the implementation of the small-scale fisheries guidelines and the human rights for small-scale fisheries are. So maybe you can elaborate on this a bit, Eddie?
Sure. I think one of the things that's different about the human rights approach is that it gives you a set of standards and a legal basis for addressing some of the issues that small-scale fishing communities face. A lot of communities around the world have been faced with competing uses for the coast. On the landward side, you know, tourism development, industrial development, conversion of mangroves for industrial land, and urban sprawl along coasts, and all of this sort of encroaches onto territories that small-scale fishers have used to live and work from. And on the seaward side, you've got things like, you know, the new conservation areas, or the allocation of fishing grounds to larger commercial interests. And all of this kind of squeezes small-scale fishers out. And, you know, working with a community to sort of use more or less pots, or, you know, to connect them to this market rather than that market, in that context, doesn't do you a great deal of good. You haven't got anything you can use to deal with those others, other than, you know, protest and things like that. But protest backed up by legitimate claim on rights, and either the threat or the action of legal process gives you a set of tools to defend traditional rights, communal rights, and to kind of maintain the integrity of the fishery community and resource. And so I think that's one of the things that's different. I think it just recognizes that the existing fishery management toolkit didn't cover that kind of stuff. There was a tool that did cover that stuff that was around. It was just a question of bringing it to the attention of fisher folk, some of whom knew about it already. Fishery managers probably knew less than fishing communities did about the existence and potential uses for human rights instruments. And I think the guidelines have done a good job of telling both fishery management agencies, conservation NGOs and development NGOs, plus fishing communities and their supporters. It's given us, I think, a common language and framework to approach these issues with. Whether it's climate change and you're dealing with climate change justice, or fighting for a fair allocation of adaptation funds, for example, or whether it's addressing coastal land use decisions or allocation of fishing grounds and quotas, all of these issues can be addressed with this set of instruments.
Thank you, Eddie. And can I ask you to also then maybe share thoughts on how the current COVID situation may affect that, positive or negative, in terms of implementing the guidelines, applying the human rights-based approach?
Yeah, I think the impacts of COVID are still playing out, but there's a couple of things I think that have risen to the surface in some way. One is that in some cases, small-scale fisheries have been able to benefit from the difficulties that longer globalized value chains have had, and are able to still supply local consumers with fish in a way, and direct sales and things like that have come back in some places as a result of the loss of these sort of longer value chains. And traditional means of processing fish, like smoking and drying and things like that, have some advantage over the sale of fresh fish and ice as well. So in some senses, the small scale and the traditional have shown themselves to be somewhat resilient, although also the COVID impacts are greatest for those poorest with least resources to fall back on, and so on. So it's ambiguous, I think, how the impact plays out in any particular place. The second major thing, I think, is that the small-scale fisher communities and organizations can use the guidelines to argue that they are eligible for support as key workers. But also, there are stimulus funds and restoration packages that various governments and international organizations are directing towards countries. And I think without an ability to lobby for a share of those, there's risks that small-scale fishing communities will be forgotten or missed out of the allocation. I don't know if any of our panelists have got experience of how that's playing out in their countries. I'd be interested to hear.
Thanks, Eddie, for these thoughts. And in fact, I think what you're saying is right. It's too early to say whether the impacts are positive, negative, and I guess there's going to be both of that. From FAO, we are kind of trying to monitor all the different initiatives around small-scale fisheries and COVID-19, just collecting the information. So we update our website every week on that. There's a lot going on, and a lot of it reflects what you just said, in terms of trying to adapt to shorter value chains, but on the other hand, also how sometimes the informality of small-scale fisheries is the obstacle that kind of hampers the access to some of those stimulus packages, or the invisibility of the sector can play out rather negative. I have another question that was flagged in the chat that I would like to give to Victor to reply, which also deals a little bit with the issue of institutional collaboration, policy coherence, how fisheries departments work with other authorities and other partners. Let me just pull up the question from Cecile. The question here is on small-scale fisheries issues often fall within the mandates of non-fisheries ministries or authorities. So how do you secure long-term buy-in of these stakeholders? Are there any good examples of how these bottlenecks have overcome? Victor, can you give us some examples from Costa Rica, share some thoughts?
Sure, thank you. It's a good question. As Nicole said, and the other panelists, the main role is in the fisheries authorities, that we have to respect and recognize the diversity of the different stakeholder interests in the marine resources. So, in this order, must be include them in the participatory process in decision making. How to apply this in the field? The fisheries authority have to work with other government authorities, like for example, environment minister or the entity or the authority that address the gender issues, the fisheries associations, the NGOs, in close coordination. I remember when we started with the implementation process in 2015, the last government of the Costa Rica had to social council. And in Copesca, that's not social institution, but participated in the close coordination with the social council to allocate, to input the different topics, the different problematic of the artisanal sector, and taking the executive decree that established the official implementation of the guideline in Costa Rica, put different actions to improve the quality of life or life quality or the life of the sector, implement different actions. So the coordination of the authorities, of the different authorities, it's a must in this process, and the legal framework is necessary to improve and to implement the actions.
I'm conscious of time. We're actually coming to an end. We've been granted 5 more minutes. So can we do a little kind of quick round of last thoughts from panelists? Just, something that came up, something that inspired you from what you heard from your panelists, something you would like the audience to give them as a take-home message in relation to the small-scale fisheries guidelines implementation, the use of the human rights-based approach as a tool to move towards sustainable small-scale fisheries. Can I invite you for one last thought? Anyone wants to start? Share a quick take-home message. Eddie, go for it. Let me unmute you.
I think people are daunted sometimes by the complexity of the guidelines and think, oh gosh, I've got to do all this. I think communities and others using them can look at the list of issues and through dialogues, through consultations, through research, through diagnoses, whatever, can figure out which are the issues in their particular place, because not every place will have all the issues that are covered in those guidelines. And I think if you kind of see it as a checklist of what the possible issues might be, and then you pick the ones that are most vital and most tractable to deal with, it becomes a much more useful instrument that way.
Thank you, Eddie. Excellent point, and I hope an inspiration, because yes, it can be a daunting task. Anybody else? Last thoughts? to share with our participants? Who would like to have the floor? Megan, yeah, ladies first.
Sorry, I put my hand up too quick. Yeah, I mean, I just want to, it's been really interesting hearing these questions and that people are all looking for positive examples. And I feel like that has moved me to think about, so there's an Indigenous scholar named Eve Tuck, and she has a really substantial paper called Suspending Damage, where she says that damage-centered research on Indigenous populations has been not a good way of moving forward, and that we really need to work on positive messages about positive outcomes, champions, and start kind of telling those stories. And so it's been really great to hear of lots of great examples of people asking for these positive examples. And I just want to touch on, I think, kind of something from what Eddie was saying about being able to fall back on the legitimacy of claims, right? And that with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, on a human rights-based approach to small-scale fisheries, we really should, and I'm thinking about Canada in this context, like take a look at our fisheries and say who should have access to these fisheries, who should be benefiting. And if we take a rights-based approach, it would be Indigenous peoples, it would be the small-scale sector. And if there's something left over, it could go somewhere else. That's a very normative stance, but it's backed up by these instruments and by a rights-based approach. So I think, this has been really wonderful, and it's given me lots of food for thought. So thanks to the panelists and to all the questions and comments as well.
Thanks to you, Megan. Mitch, I think your hand also went up for last comments.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. I was particularly curious as to one of the interventions by Megan concerning how we assess value chain benefits and how do we look at giving an appropriate value to the middle person in terms of the services that they provide along with purchasing the fish product. I think that is an important thought to really take into consideration when we look at value chain analysis. Yes, because it's not just economic, it moves to different aspects. So that was really interesting for me and something that I really have to think about a bit. Yes, and also I'm keen to also see how we can look at getting capacities of the fisheries sector both appreciated and enhanced to offer this level of participation where we have maximum contribution to societal good. Because in the Caribbean, it is increasingly being recognized that small-scale fisheries are an essential service to society. And that is important. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mitch. And yes, it's certainly important to think about the value chains, not only in terms of, the economic benefits, but really the social benefits and also the environmental one. Victor, you have a last short thought to share? Okay, go ahead.
Gracias, Nicole. No, only for finalize the human right-based approach, bring the people closer to the processes. So said us that the human right must be incorporated in the construction of public policy. Like Fisheries Authority, we have to now, I think, how specifically in the fisheries and the aquaculture sector, the homework is recognize the diversity of the stakeholders, recognize the small-scale fishery sectors in all the countries, go with the hand with the different actors or stakeholders to improve the quality of life, the quality conditions, improve the situations in the field, in the different communities. In this context, the scope of the spirit of the guidance and the human rights based approach are very linked with, and the government authorities have to move to implement in specific case, in real cases, and the legal framework is a must.
Thanks for this, Victor. Good reminder. We're going over our time, which is a pity because our kind of attendance number has now gone up and doubled from when we started. So that's a compliment to our panelists. I think you have done a good job to attract more and more people. Apparently, the word has spread while we were on. So let me take the opportunity to thank you very much. First of all, our panelists for being with us, including Paul, who unfortunately had to be cut out or was cut out by the technology. So thanks for all your contributions. Thanks for bringing in the different perspectives from academia, from government, from small-scale fishery organizations. I think this makes it a very rich discussion that is touching upon many, many issues. Thanks a lot to all the audience engagement. Thanks for your stimulating questions. Feel free to get in touch with all of us. I'm speaking for the panelists, but I'm sure they agree. If there are follow-up questions, we're happy to engage. We do need all of you. I think this is something that came out clear, is that there's a role to play for all of us in implementing the small-scale fisheries guidelines, but also in promoting the human rights-based approach. So really get in touch, take action, and don't wait for the others necessarily to act. There's a lot of things we can all do, and also look for partnerships, how we can move things together. Let me thank again Too Big to Ignore and all our partners that helped organize this session. And let me remind you that what Megan also said, what came out of the chat is this hunger, this appetite for good experiences, for good practices. What have we learned? What is it we can build on? What is it we can share and do better in the future? And we have an important opportunity coming up for that. In 2022, there will be the International Year of Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture that we will all celebrate. And this is a time to prepare for that year. And that is an opportunity to really make it a celebration rather than just pointing out the challenges. In a way, the challenges we have identified in many ways. No? The guidelines, in a way, are the result of this process also of identifying what are the critical issues. So let's look at that year also as an opportunity for sharing good examples and way forward. So again, start preparing, start taking the opportunity so that we can celebrate 2022 to really show the importance of the small-scale food producers and the importance of their contributions within the food systems, but also in terms of more broadly poverty eradication and development. So with this, I'm going to thank all of you, and we're going to end the seminar here. Thank you very much for joining this, and thanks for attending. Bye-bye, everybody.